Conley?
Here.
Mr. Greenspan?
Here.
Mr. Miller? Here. Mr. Brady? Mr. Germana?
Here. Ms. Simon's here.
Ms. Simon is here. Thank you. You have a quorum.
Thank you. Before we ask for any public comment, just want to just reiterate at least what we went through at the last meeting, and that was to get some information and concepts and ideas from the county executive as to the casino revenue and what he saw the proceeds of that going towards. The second meeting, which is today's meeting, again, the committee of the whole, it was the desire to get information in regards to how those funds are going to flow from the casino down through the various processes, and then ultimately what we hope will end up back here in the county for use in some form. And with that, Mr. Wade Steen is going to speak to that issue. As an invited guest, some people were asking me if we could contact the city of Cleveland to get at least a general overview of concepts and ideas as far as how their proceeds are going to be used, without any specificity we're not looking for, but whatever information they would be willing to share with us at this point in time in the process. And with that, the Director of Development, Mr. Chris Warren, has agreed to be here today, and so for that we thank you very much. And with that, I will ask, is there anybody that signed in for public comment? And then, excuse me, that was to be followed in at our third meeting with ideas and concepts from our various different members of the council themselves to be bringing forth whatever ideas and thoughts they had to start to then flush out where we go. But I thought that it would be best to be building upon where the funds are going to be, how much we're going to be looking at, and use that as the foundation for where we're going to go as far as a committee of the whole. So with that, has there been anybody signed in at this point?
Mr. Chairman, no one has signed in to speak.
Very good. Has everybody had a chance to look at the minutes of the meeting of May 22nd, 2012?
Mr. Chairman, I move that they be approved as presented.
Moved by Mr. Miller, second by Ms. Conwell. Is there any comments, additions, or deletions? Hearing none, all in favor of approval of the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes have been approved. Is there a reading that we can have as far as the resolution or the ordinance for purposes of this hearing?
Reading the matter referred to committee, ordinance number 2012-0011, an ordinance establishing an economic development fund for the purpose of collecting and expending proceeds from gross casino revenues and declaring the necessity that this ordinance become immediately effective.
And at this point in time, Mr. Steen, if you can bring us up to speed as far is the pot sitting outside the door waiting to be spent yet, or not quite there?
In the rainbow.
Yeah, it's at the end of the rainbow, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the chance to present today on casino revenue. We were asked by the chair to provide an overview, and I'm hoping all of you have copies of the PowerPoint. I'm sorry. Thanks, Cliff. So what I'm hoping to do today, along with Budget Director Matt Rubino, is to just talk about defining casino revenue, how it's going to be allocated, our revenue projections and the annual impact to the county, what the county share is, the permissible uses, and some challenges and other considerations. We've also consulted with the law department because questions were put forward as far as bonding out potential casino revenues in the future and things of that nature. As I'm guessing many of you are aware, it was in November 2009 that the Ohio voters approved an amendment to the Constitution allowing casino gambling. Article 1506C2, and you can read, describes what the casino tax will be, 33% basically of gross revenues of the 4 casino facilities, the first to open being here in Cleveland. And you can see all the beneficiaries of the casino tax, which would be counties, school districts, cities, and the state. The 33% of gross revenues is broken down as outlined below. I'm going to focus almost exclusively now as we go forward on the 51% that goes to county governments based on population. You can see everyone else that's going to benefit from the casino revenues, and those percentages will total 100. But for today's discussion, we're talking about the 51% because that's the part that impacts us in Cuyahoga County.
So that's 51% of the 33%.
Yes, it is, Mr. Chairman.
So roughly we're looking at 16.5% of the total revenues then.
Yeah, in fact, as we go through the presentation, we're going to break it down, go year by year, allocate when we think it'll all come online. So this is just in pie chart form. Cuyahoga County will receive a share of the 51% of the revenue collected from all 4 casinos, not just the Cleveland venue. And we wanted to emphasize that. I'm surprised the number of people in the general public who assume that the Cleveland casino opened and that's our revenue. And really, the percentage that comes to us, which is 11% of the 51%, is ours. It gets shared statewide, all of the revenue generated here. So the casino revenues are pooled and then allocated out. The actual allocations are hard-coded in the Constitution, and they will never change. We're going to come back to that in our presentation. So if you look at the breakout, 51% goes to Ohio counties. That's their share. Cuyahoga County represents 11% of the population, currently 11.09 based upon the 2010 census. 50% of the 11% goes to the county, 50% goes to the city. You'll notice that Cleveland as a host city will also get an additional 5% share from that pooled pot. So when you simplify it, we're down to 50% of 11% is what comes to us. And what we try to do is, at the request of the chairman, is estimate when we thought revenues would be coming in. The one thing we found is when we read newspaper articles, many just assumed you're going to get X amount of casino revenue, and that was based upon the revenue estimate from the casinos, 100% operational on day one in hand. And we all realize that there's a ramping up period, and Budget Director Rubino will talk with you later. 2 of the casinos have already reduced their revenue estimates 50% of what they were earlier. The Cleveland casino had estimated gross revenues of $600 million. Today, as I stand here, that estimate is $300 million, and that's factored into our calculation. So when you go from $600 million to $300 million, the amount of money that's going to flow to Cuyahoga County is immediately impacted in a substantial way. And we'll walk through all of our projections so that you can see exactly where we got the numbers and what we think the county will receive and when they'll receive it. Actually, at this point, I'm going to ask Director Rubino to come up, and he's going to talk about the distribution now, and then I'll come up at the close. But we're going to walk you through what we think the budgetary impact will be to the county as we go forward. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Matt Rubino, Office of Budget and Management. I'm going to pick up where we left off. Now we have an idea of the definition of that casino tax and how it's calculated. The pieces Wade just described are set. There's no questions about those. They're, again, hard-coded, very explicit in the amendment that was approved. So now what we do, we need to take some ingredients and make some assumptions and come up with what we think are good estimates for what type of revenue we will begin to realize starting this year, second half of this year, and then going into 2013 and 2014. And that's what the next 6 or 7 slides will cover, and then we'll go into some other considerations. But we're going to focus back on, now that we understand the rate of the tax and how it's allocated down to counties, look at the distribution, and then plug that in and do some scenarios to see what type of revenue we're going to be expecting in the next few years. So we're looking at basing this on gross revenue, so that is the total revenue brought in by all 4 casinos once they're up and running in Ohio. As you know, right now there are 2, one in Cleveland, one in Toledo, 2 more left. The distribution is going to be administered by the state. So quite like sales tax, it's collected at the local level, but it's administered by the state and then distributed down to counties. This is going to work in a similar fashion. The operators are going to make their 33% tax payments to the state of Ohio. State will then do the distribution on a quarterly basis. So that's where it's slightly different than sales tax. Sales tax is once a month. This will be a quarterly basis. And right now what we know is that these distributions 4 times per year will occur in the month following the end of the quarter. So for example, second quarter this year ends June 30th. July is the following month, and we're told that we will get our first distribution of the revenue that's available at the end of July. And we'll talk more about that. But again, that's with part of May and all of June for 2 casinos. So we're not expecting a gigantic amount of distribution, but it'll be the first test as far as what kind of revenue we'll be seeing. It's more complicated than that, but that'll be our first look at the revenue. So we want to talk about, in terms of the revenue projections, what is the maximum annual potential once all 4 casinos are up and running, once they've opened and stabilized their business model. How much can they generate on an annual basis? That becomes, couple that with the allocation formula, that's what we can expect on an annual basis once we have a stabilized baseline, meaning all 4 are up and running at what they believe is their full potential. We have some preliminary numbers, thanks to the Cincinnati Enquirer. They published an article. There's a link to that article in the last slide. They did publish an article. They were able to get some updated revenue estimates for 3 of the 4 locations. The Columbus location did not have an update, but I'll address that in a few slides down the line here. But we do have updated numbers, and they are lower than the estimates that were put forth back in 2009. It's not a big surprise. They're probably 50% lower than originally estimated, and I'll come to that. But we're talking about maximum annual revenue. We think 2014 is the year, the beginning of 2014, as you'll see, is when we expect to hit that point, when we have all 4 venues operating, and we have a full 12 months with all 4 paying that tax, and then it being distributed by the state down to the county. So 2014, you'll see, when we look at our scenarios, is the base year, the stable year. And I mentioned that the 2009 estimates have been lowered right now. Until we have a solid body of data to pull from, we're dependent on the casino operators to give us their estimates or best case for what they think revenue will be on an annual basis. So we're going with those numbers that were printed on June 1st. So the basic calculation, as I mentioned, and we have a table to the left. We have a line for all 4 casinos. I'm on slide 10. I have the opening dates, and we have the projected revenue based on what we know from printed stories. Here's one thing to note. The Columbus numbers were not updated in that article that was available. There are no updated numbers since 2009. What we did for the Columbus revenue is drop it by 50%, because that's about what the other, and that's footnoted, that's about what the other estimates were dropped by from 2009. So we're assuming the estimates that were provided on June 1st, and then we're using 50% of the 2009 Columbus number, which we think is accurate or should be comparable. And there's some other factors why I think that's probably conservative. We'll come back to that. So we're applying that 33% tax on those potential revenue amounts, those potential gross revenue amounts. So right now we're showing a billion, just over $1 billion in potential revenue, gross revenue. Do the math, it's just 33% of that, almost over $1 billion. You come up with a maximum annual tax revenue for distribution to everybody of $344 million. So consider that in 2009, that tax number was closer to $650 million. So we've come down considerably since the idea was pitched to voters, approved, and now we're in the implementation phase. The expectations have come down. Not a big surprise. A 50% drop is significant, though, I'd have to say. I would understand that the estimates would change, but that is a large drop. So now we have an idea of what our maximum revenue and associated tax revenue is. Now we do the basic exercise of flowing it through that allocation that was described in the casino amendment. It's 3 numbers, 51, 11, 50. Of the 344, 51% is going to be distributed to all counties. We get a per capita distribution based on our population that's just over 11%. So we take 11% of that $175 million number that goes to counties. Our 11% share for the county, not county government, for the county, is $19.5 million. And then according to the last number of those 3 numbers, 50% would be allocated to Cuyahoga County government. So based on those revenue estimates that we have, representing maximum annual gross revenue, we're looking at $9.7 million potential revenue if we assume all of those factors hold. And it's fairly straightforward. So obviously the big variable is how successful the casinos are at generating gross revenue. Everything else is already delineated in the law. I'm on slide 12. So now that we have an idea of how to make an estimate for total maximum annual, we want to look at doing a projection, meaning how do we take that information, basic information, and flow it through a multi-year, in this case, a 3-year revenue projection. And we have a few variables we can tweak a little bit to come up with, in this case, you'll see we're going to do 3 successive scenarios, just to give you an idea how we start off this year and what the potential build to that maximum annual distribution to the county would take place. So we've already done that. So the revenue ingredients we've mentioned, the revenue projections from the casino operators. Timing of the venue opening, which we build into these scenarios. We know when Toledo and Cleveland have opened. We have estimates of when the Cincinnati and Columbus casinos will open, so we can factor those in. The build up to potential capacity, as you'll see, we're going to make assumptions how quickly the individual operators can build up to their maximum gross revenue. What we're going to make assumptions on is that once a casino opens, that right out of the gate, they're not necessarily going to achieve stabilized 100% capacity to generate gross revenue. So as you see, as we go through the 3 scenarios, we play around with that variable and show you what happens if they have to build up to 100% capacity. And I'll explain that again when we look at the scenarios. We're going to give you alternate versions of the revenue. I think I already covered that and vary the assumptions. So we'll look at scenario 1, and I'll explain the layout of the slide. The next 3 slides look the same. We just changed some of the variables. On the left, we have a table. It's similar to the table a few slides ago. We have a line for each location. We have their base revenue estimate, which are taken straight from that slide 3 or 4 slides ago. And then we have a column for 12, 13, and 14 where we add up the total tax dollars from that 33%, and then we just flow it through that 511110 filter to come up with what we think the county would be receiving from the distribution for the next 3 years. We're going to stick with the same opening dates for scenario 1. Cleveland and Toledo are open. Columbus opens November of this year, and Cincinnati opening in the first quarter. Right now, we're not exactly clear if those dates will be hit, but for this purpose, we'll use as opening dates. Obviously, the more months those 2, Columbus and Cincinnati, are open in 12 and 13, the more revenue we will realize, because again, we're sharing revenue or getting a piece of revenue from all 4 locations. That's why that's important. In this model, if you look across the top where you see 100% above 12, 2013, and 2014, we are assuming that those revenue estimates, they can achieve those as soon as they open. So once the casino is open, they will, on an annualized basis, they can achieve those estimates. So for example, Cleveland would achieve that $300 million on an annualized basis as soon as they're open, and the same thing with the other 3. So we're just saying their estimates are for the year, regardless of when they've opened, they can immediately start generating up to that estimate they provided a few weeks ago. And as you can see, the yellow line across the bottom, $2.5 million.
We don't have colors on ours, so.
I'm sorry.
We don't have colors. So.
Yeah, we wanted to save on toner.
It's part of the program. Or
The bottom line of numbers, it says Cuyahoga County share 50%. That gives you the expectation of what will be distributed to Cuyahoga County government, our portion, our half of the 11%. $2.6 million this year. And then we almost hit the maximum capacity by next year based on this assumption, $9 million. And then capping off at $9.7 million, which if you remember, we go back a few slides, that was our calculation for what we think we could achieve annually on a gross basis. So we're building up to that amount. Let's try it a different way. I'm on slide 14. It looks the same. There's some factors that are different. We left the opening dates the same. We're going to assume they open. Columbus opens 2012 in November. Cincinnati first quarter of 2013. We're going to stick with the revenue estimates. But if you look across the top where it says revenue potential, we're going to slow down that buildup. We're going to say this year they can achieve 75% on an annualized basis. Not 75% open, but once they open, they can start achieving on an annualized basis 75% of that total possible revenue amount for the year. As you can see, Cincinnati, if you look across the line, there's a 0 in 2012. That's because they're not projected to open this year, so we're not showing any revenue coming from the Cincinnati location. What we've done for 2013 is assume they can achieve, they're all open, they can achieve up to 90% of that potential maximum gross revenue, which again determines how much casino tax the county would receive. And then in 2014, we're at 100% capacity to generate that $9.7 million figure that we've seen in 2 slides now. So that bottom line, Cuyahoga County share 50%, $2 million this year. Next year, we hit the bottom end of that range that we've talked about when we discussed the ordinance, $8 million, $8.1 million. And then all things remaining the same, we would achieve annual revenue of $9.7 million. And that's again, meaning the revenue estimates hold. All 4 open in 2014, and they're able to hit 100% or what we're called their stable year, their stabilized year, fully in 2014. Last scenario, this one's a little more conservative. Speaking for Wade and myself, we would probably take this type of approach, assumption or scenario number 3, when we're talking about what can we realize going over the next 3 years. We've done a few things to adjust for this scenario to make it more conservative. One, we've pushed the Columbus opening to December 2012, so we've moved it back 1 month, which means 1 month less revenue flowing through the allocation. And then we've assumed Cincinnati would open in the second quarter. That's merely an assumption. It's not based on information that they won't open on time, but just to show you if one of these factors changes, such as one of the casinos is delayed in opening, and it has an impact on how quickly we can build up to that maximum annual potential revenue that we've seen in the past few slides. We've also, if you look right the middle, just about the middle column, it says percentage change in revenue estimate. We've taken the casino revenue estimates and we've dialed those down 10%. So we're saying for Cleveland, for example, if that $300 million were lowered by 10%, meaning they will decrease their potential revenue estimate on an annual basis by 10%, that's what we're feeding into this last scenario. And then on the top line, revenue potential, we've assumed a slightly slower build to full capacity on the revenue. So we're going 75% in year 1, 80%, and we're going to assume that maybe if Cincinnati opens later, they're going to have less time in the year to build to that 100% benchmark of generating gross revenue, and then hitting 100% in 2014. And as you can see, the bottom line, Cuyahoga County share 50%. 1.8 million this year, so just under 2 million, still fairly close to the other 2 scenarios. But what happens is the build to that maximum annual potential for the county, it slows down. We would realize around 5.5 million next year, and then build to 8.8 million. And you can notice it's not that $9.7 million number that we had talked about. That's because we decided to show the impact of decreasing the casino revenue estimates. They've already dropped 50%. It's hard to say if they're managing expectations and going with an achievable number for now, and then wait and see. We'll probably have a better idea once we have a good 6 months, 12 months of actual experience to gauge how much do we think these venues can generate. In particular, once we have all 4 operating by 2013, looking at what's that potential. Are they close to what they thought they could generate? And there may be some seasonality in the numbers too that we're not sure of. These projections assume straight line estimates. Because we're doing annual projection iterations, it doesn't make as big of a difference. But there's probably going to be some seasonal or cyclical variability in the numbers, which are not in here, and we don't know what that will be yet.
Because you have this slide up, Mr. Rubino,
yes.
You were forecasting not necessarily launching on their due dates. Do you remember what the due dates were that we launched the casino here in relationship to the expectation?
Mr. Chairman, for the Horseshoe Cleveland, the last date before the May date I thought was February of this year. Okay. So I think they missed it by 3 months, but there was a constant, flow of information from the operators. We're going to have to push it back 1 month, 2 months, so it wasn't a surprise. I haven't seen anything in the way of news from the Columbus venue or Cincinnati if they need more time. It appears that they are on schedule based on what I've read in media reports. And we'll come back to the Columbus venue because there's an interesting factor with the Columbus venue that I think will speak to not only what that casino can generate in gross revenue, but also what revenue will be available to distribute down to counties in the other areas of local government. I'll come back to that point a few slides from now. Moving on. So we'll talk about some other considerations. I think we have a good feel for how to project this revenue. We know there's multiple potential outcomes. I think once we get a good 6 months under our belt, we'll have a better idea. But we know there should be a build to a maximum annual potential. So I think that part is very definable. What about other considerations, things that can impact how the casinos operate, how well the revenue performance ends up being, and also how does that translate into revenue realized by the county to use for some of the purposes we've been discussing in committee meetings. On the casino business model itself, in the revenue estimates, we have the latest available. Those are subject to change. I'm sure they will. We won't know until Again, we've moved on down the road with a few more months of experience. Will the business continue to grow? Will it plateau? If they generate about the same amount of revenue over the next few years, that'll be a stable revenue stream, but we don't know going past that 2.5-3 year window how sustainable that model is and how those revenue numbers would look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So there's some uncertainty there. Competition from nearby states. I know there's Detroit, Michigan, I know they've had some problems with Ohio having casinos. It obviously degrades the revenue those casinos can generate if people are staying in Ohio or coming to Ohio as an alternate to the other sites in Michigan, Indiana. And we have Pennsylvania, New York, racetrack betting in Virginia, I believe, and then Canada, Windsor. So right now we're the new entrant into this market. Other states that aren't necessarily adjacent to Ohio are also getting into casino gambling. I think Maryland may be the latest state, and they have a much higher tax on gross revenue. I think their tax is 67%. So I don't know if we're a direct competitor with Maryland, but it's certainly not too far away to draw people from Pennsylvania and West Virginia and other states that may come to Ohio in the time being. The diminution of casino revenue as a result of something else that's going on. You may be familiar with the move to have racetrack betting or horse racing, racinos or VLTs at the site. This basically provide alternate venues to gamble, slot machines mainly, at horse racing tracks in Ohio. And how does that impact the numbers we've discussed? Well, in two ways that I can think of. One, it's a competition model. If people are willing to go to a racino in lieu of a casino, that's going to affect the business model and in turn that maximum annual revenue potential that we've been talking about and use as a basis for our projections. So that draws business away from the casinos and it could lower those revenue estimates. The other key factor would be if I spend $1 at a racetrack, slot machine or racino, that dollar does not flow through the allocation model we discussed earlier on. The tax dollars that flow through the horse track gambling go directly to the school district. So it's more of a creature of the lottery commission. All of this revenue, they would bypass that casino allocation that we discussed earlier. So you're taking $1 out of the system for the operator, decreasing the revenue. You're also taking it out of that distribution that the county would receive. So for every $1 that goes to a racino, that's $1 less to flow through that distribution on the casino side. So that's important to note. This has been a topic of discussion for the past 2 years. As soon as the amendment for casino gambling was on the ballot and passed, there was already a discussion of opening up the ability of racetracks to also get into gambling. So it was only a matter of time. If you looked at various white papers or research, the numbers that we were beginning to see after 2009 were already assuming a degradation of revenue from casino gambling because of the entrance of horse track gambling. So I would believe that the numbers that have been provided by the operators at the beginning of the month must include some impact. I don't know what percentage they're using, but I got to believe that they reduced their revenue estimates in part because they know there's going to be more competition from the horse tracks. And the operators are also in the horse track gambling industry. So they'll be making their money at either the casino venues or the racetrack venues, either way. They're probably more ambivalent on how the tax dollars are flowed through or allocated to local government. And there's good news too, obviously. Enhancement of the local economy, there's a multiplier. The more people we have in our county spending dollars, the more sales tax. If it spurs development, property tax values or collections could go up. So there's obviously some potential multiplier there. It's hard to say what that is yet. I think we'll have a better idea again when we have a year of experience to see what is the footprint, the impact of having a casino in downtown Cleveland. Other considerations, a little bit about the legislative changes that could complicate our distribution. That 51% that goes to counties, it's in the Constitution. It can't be changed unless there was an amendment to change that portion of the Constitution. If you've heard other elected officials or policymakers discuss finding a way to reroute some of those dollars to schools or elsewhere, it's not true. They can't do it. It's already in the Constitution. That 51% is set. There has been some attempts, or at least one attempt this year, to craft legislation that could direct counties to spend a portion of the revenue on specific purposes. We had an amendment placed in the casino regulation bill earlier this year that had attempted to direct counties to spend a certain portion on law enforcement. That was removed, but that discussion has not gone away. House Bill 386, which is the casino regulation bill that I believe was signed today or is going to be signed, it did not earmark any portion of our 51%. So there was no operating instructions in the casino bill that's being approved that the 51% that you're getting, spend X percent on this or that. Right now, there's nothing of that nature. There were some changes or additions within that regulation bill that directed the state how to spend that 2% and 3% allocation. Let me go back to the beginning. These don't directly impact us. I think there was some additional direction on the 2% for treatment, and I think also on the how the 3% for the racing commission is spent, but nothing on that 51% for the county. You know, I have a quote in there for the fourth bullet. There's a quote from an Ohio County Commissioner Association State House report. This is back in February when that amendment was pulled, but I think they're a very well-informed organization, and the quote was, "The general discussion on counties' use of casino revenues, as well as bigger picture discussion of dollars going to various local governments, is likely to occur in the future." So this is a topic, an area of policy that is going to continue to be discussed. And the last bullet really is a good segue into that. We know the 51% to counties, that distribution it's locked down. But there are other ways that the state can affect revenue that is passed down to counties and local governments. And we know full well when we were developing our 2012-2013 budget, one of the largest topics for discussion or areas of concern was how the state was going to cut local government fund. The state still has control on how those dollars are distributed on a formulaic basis. Right now, we have a good idea of what we will be getting this year, and then the lower amount we'll be receiving next year as a result of the enacted state budget, House Bill 153. I know there is a movement, mostly coming from the perspective of townships, to change the local government fund allocation, the formula, to the benefit of townships. The concept is that, hey, counties and cities are going to make a good amount of revenue off of the casino tax allocation structure. Townships aren't. So perhaps the state could help townships out by changing the direction or the flow somewhat of LGF allocation to benefit townships who aren't going to reap the same type of benefits that counties and large cities will receive. Right now, there is no legislation I'm aware of to do that. I know of one representative for certain that is very serious about doing that. In fact, he was quoted in a State House report a week or two ago, and the quote was, he is deadly serious about changing the LGF allocation to help townships out, which could mean, sure, we're set with our share of casino dollars, but there could be an offset of local government fund dollars if these types of changes are made. It's very early in the process. It's hard to say how that will play out, but it will be a topic of discussion that we'll have to be surveilling on a continual basis to see where it's at. Other considerations, I'll briefly talk about permissible uses. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail, but I want to provide some context or color for that discussion. As you know, tax revenue received by counties is traditionally spent on operations, but as you know, the biennial budget we adopted and are living under right now was completed without assuming any benefit for casino revenue, which means that revenue it's freed up, it's available for county priorities like economic development. So I know some localities are probably planning on using this new revenue to help prop up operation, to help fill the hole that was in part created by the recession and also in part by the state budget. Right now, we developed a budget that does not rely on continued operations from this tax. So it's available for these discussions on these priorities. Spending tax dollars on traditional economic development, things that we're familiar with, there are restrictions in the Constitution in Article 8. We have to be mindful of those. So developing a plan for productive investment of these revenue, you have to keep in mind the rules that are in place and the legal requirements, whether we're spending these dollars in kind on a cash basis, or whether we would like to perhaps use them as a pledge of security on bonds or as a designated source of repayment on some sort of county debt. We have to keep those considerations in mind. going to talk a little bit, one slide worth of bonding using any tax revenue, casino revenue in particular, though, as to bond as a source of repayment. We need to do additional research before we know the feasibility of securing or repaying bonds with casino tax receipts. It's a brand new revenue source. It is an industry that is new to the state. So right now there's obviously some variables and unpredictability in that revenue stream, so we have to keep that in mind. But let's talk about when the county wants to issue bonds. We have to identify some form of a pledge. What are we backing up this mortgage with, a revenue source? And then what other things we need to consider? What's the source of repayment? What are we designating the technical source of how we're going to make that annual payment for those bonds, that debt service on those bonds? We have 4 main areas of concern when we issue debt: credit risk, statutory and legal limits, which we discussed a little bit earlier, operational capacity. Do we have the capacity within our ongoing operations, namely general fund, to make an additional annual debt service payment or mortgage payment on bonds? And then the revenue model, the thing we've discussed over the past few minutes. We have traditionally used one of 3 pledges when securing bonds at the county. The most common of which is the general obligation pledge. Counties and in cities and other localities use that pledge. It's also known as an LTGO pledge. It's our standard vanilla pledge on bonds. Non-tax revenue pledge. The non-tax revenue pledge is the pledge or security for bonds we issue for economic development. So for example, when we issue bonds for the medical mart, the pledge on those bonds was actually receipts from non-tax revenue. So basically, if you look at that revenue pie that was in the first quarter report for the general fund, anything that's not sales tax or LGF, because that's tax dollars flowed from the state, anything that's not specifically a tax is part of that non-tax revenue pool of dollars that can be used to pledge. And the reason we use non-tax revenue is because, going back to Article 8 of the Ohio Constitution, there's certain limitations on how we can spend tax dollars on economic development. And it depends on what we envision as economic development. So there are some moving parts to figure out. The additional analysis of how a bond issue would fit into the confines of all of these factors. How does it fit into the legal requirements? What other things do we need to consider when we issue bonds? Doing a presentation to have the bonds rated. How do we look on paper when we're using this revenue source that we know is new and we're still mapping out the course of that revenue source? So there are some unconventional aspects of casino revenue that will create some challenges that we need to do some further research and perhaps look outside the state to see if there's some experience out there specifically dealing with revenue from a tax related to a specific industry like casinos or gambling. So we want to look at the stability of the revenue stream. It is untested, at least in Ohio. It could become complicated to rate since it is new and there's not a large body of work for Ohio for a casino tax. And again, the fallback for making payments, if this revenue dips below our expectation, would be general operating dollars. So it would come out of the general fund most likely, just like any other type of obligation. If the source of repayment that's designated for bond falls below the estimates, the county always has identified a backstop for paying those bonds. So the same would be in play here if we're talking about using casino tax. That's the last slide. We forwarded you the file version of this presentation. There are links to the stories we used, so you can copy and paste into your web browser if you want to read some of the articles. And that's the last slide.
Can you send this to us electronically so we can then, it's a lot easier to copy and paste than typing?
Mr. Chairman, we had, and if I could, in closing, we wanted to thank the committee for the chance to present this overview. And again, Matt mentioned it, but I want to go back to, it was scenario 3, slide 15. And we believe that to be our best estimate of future revenues as we stand here today, because we made modifications because we knew that one of the casinos, at least the one here, opened a little bit later than expected. So to move opening dates back makes sense. We know that 3 of the 4 have already announced reductions in their estimated revenue. So to reduce revenue another 10% seemed to make sense and be conservative. And we slowed down the ramp up primarily, again, to be conservative. We're not sure. So I wanted to emphasize these are very conservative numbers, but I do believe that's what you would expect of your fiscal officer and budget director, to give you what are reasonably conservative estimates of revenue. And so that scenario 3 is the one, if we had to give a revenue projection today based upon what we know, that would be the one we would give.
Questions from the council? Anybody? Yes, Mr. Rogers first. Anybody else?
just for clarity, the 51% that's being distributed amongst the counties, is that all 88 counties are receiving a portion?
Mr. Chairman and Councilman, yes, that's all counties on a per capita basis.
And if the county does not have a city within its boundaries has a population of over 80,000, it all goes to the county?
Correct,
It's not
Councilman
split.
Rogers, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Greenspan?
Great, thank you. The 5% that's going to directly to the host city, is that 5% then being divided by 4 for the 4 host cities, or is that 5% of the revenue of that host city's casino revenue?
Mr. Chairman and Councilman Greenspan, I believe it is 5% of the host city's casino dollars. I will double check, but that's the way I read it, that it is 5% of that city's casino revenue. So it is separate from the 11%. The city is splitting the 11%, but they're also getting a separate 5%, I think, on the host city's casino only.
Okay, and the other revenue sources from the casino, other than gambling, such as food and beverage and ancillary services, is that 33% calculated on that as well?
Mr. Chairman, we read that as gross revenue, so we think that's all in. That's every dollar they earn is in that gross revenue category.
Okay. I think I had one more question. I do. The Cincinnati, Toledo, and Columbus casinos, those are, once they're up and operational, those are fully, that's as big as that casino is going, those casinos are going to become, correct? But the Cleveland casino, we know there's a second phase. And when is that second phase expected to go into operation? And then when it does, is there an anticipated increase in revenue as a result of that phase 2 becoming operational?
To Councilman Greenspan, through the chair, I noted your use of words, "we know." I guess we don't know that there will be a second phase, and so we're assuming right now what stands today, and the revenue estimate provided by the casino operator is the $300 million. If there is a second phase and there's a new revenue estimate, we would have to factor that in, so that would be a positive. But I guess we didn't take it as a known. We took it as possibly there's a second phase, but we do know there's phase 1 that's up and running, so we didn't incorporate any of that into our scenario.
Okay, great. That I have no further questions.
Just to follow up, Councilman Greenspan, I would say even if there was a phase 2 in the works, it most likely would not have impacted that 3-year horizon we presented. I'm guessing it would not be open before 2014 or 2015 anyway. So it would be considerably out in the out years.
So I believe that, didn't they purchase another $85 million worth of property?
I believe
for
that was
phase
purchased
2?
initially. That was purchased at the very beginning of the process, but there's a lot of people that own land.
Right.
They don't have.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Miller?
Director, could you elaborate on the restrictions in the Ohio Constitution regarding the spending of tax dollars for economic development?
Mr. Chairman and Councilman Miller, that article of the Constitution lays out the permissible uses for economic development that can be undertaken. There is a restriction on using revenue received from taxation for those purposes. But again, not knowing exactly how we would like to utilize these casino tax dollars and what we define as economic development could answer whether or not we're restricted for doing the full gamut of things that we've talked about. There are ways to identify revenue and pledge against bonds and use it for economic development. This may be one of those cases, but I really think we need to do more research once we know the exact use of the dollars and how we'd like to spend the revenue and whether or not we want to designate this revenue as a pledge or source of repayment. But there are fairly straightforward and explicit requirements within that Article 8 that explains how you can do economic development if you're a county and what types of restrictions there are in identifying revenue. So we would most likely utilize one of the pledges we've used in the past for issuing debt. I think the big question becomes, what are the exact uses of these dollars once they're in that fund that the ordinance calls for?
Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
Director, could you be a little more explicit as to what some of the restrictions are?
If I can, to Councilman Miller through the chair, I hesitate a bit, and I'm looking at our law director kind of for a lifeline, because we had advised that we were going to be making this presentation, and I think some of the questions would be of a legal nature, and so we did talk with the law department about particular questions about legality. We know how we interpret, but we're just simple numbers guys. And so, Majid, do you want to save
Sure,
me here? Thank you.
Sure, and I think that it's Article 10, Section 13 of the Ohio Constitution, and it's labeled economic development, and it starts with the purpose, which is to create or preserve jobs and employment opportunities. So the purpose, the traditional economic development purpose that you think of. But then when it talks about what it's permitting the state and the political subdivisions to do, it's to acquire, construct, enlarge, improve, or equip, and to sell, lease, exchange, or otherwise dispose of property, structures, equipment, and facilities within the state of Ohio. So that's number one that you can do. For industry, commerce, distribution, and research. So those are the purposes for which you can do it. 2 is to make or guarantee loans. And 3 is to borrow money and issue bonds or other obligations. And that's, I think, the section that you're talking about. To provide monies for the acquisition, construction, enlargement, improvement, or equipment of such property, structures, equipment, and facilities. So it seems to be tied to real estate development, things that you're doing with real estate development or equipment. Now, that's been brought into, that's been applied more broadly than that, but you really have to know specifically what the project that you're trying to do, it's a lot more complicated than that, but the express language of the Constitution seems to be specific about, property, equipment, facilities, things of that nature for research, for industry, for commerce.
Mr. Chairman, Councilman Miller, to give you some real examples of what we've undertaken in the past 10 years that we'd considered economic development and were permitted to do. We have 2 separate issuances of brownfield fund dollars. We had an issuance for a program called commercial redevelopment. And again, those were loans. That was done in 2010. The medical mart, by definition, was also considered an economic development purpose, and we utilized our non-tax revenue pledge for the medical mart. And going back a couple decades, the Gateway Arena project, which is now Quicken Loans Arena, the bonds the county had issued were also issued as economic development bonds, revenue bonds, using that traditional non-tax revenue pledge that we use for economic development purposes. So those are some examples of things that we've done in the past that we have termed economic development. There's a whole host of other potential uses out there that we could term economic development, but they may be different or newer approaches than what we've done in the past. So it's hard to say exactly how it comes together, the funding and the source of repayment in the end.
Thank you. Mr. Chair.
So Director, these purposes that you described, are these what we're allowed to do with tax revenue?
Mr. Chairman, to Councilman Miller, no, we use non-tax revenue as the pledge for these purposes.
So we're not allowed to use tax revenue for these economic development purposes?
For the purposes stated in the Constitution, it depends on what we plan to do here at the county. So I could not answer that until we know exactly how we want to utilize the dollars for the fund.
If I may, Mr. Chair, you're not allowed to use tax revenue to obligate tax revenue for purposes of bonding for these purposes.
Questions? Follow on? Mr. Germano, anybody else?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the fiscal officer, Mr. Rubino, for giving us this formula. And I know it's not your fault, but I am really steamed because, whoever came up with this, especially when they come up with 80,000, don't they know that Cuyahoga County has got 2 cities of over 80,000? None of the other 4 counties with casinos have cities any close to the city of Parma, which is the 7th largest city in the state. And the other part of my frustration is, they just don't understand that Cuyahoga County is not the same as the other 88 counties. we are developed, substantially developed, and you take any of these other counties, besides the main town in the county, they're undeveloped, they're rural, so on. So, you know, we have a history of 59 cities that have got infrastructure and needs, and they just can't, you know, you just can't divide things by 88 and come up with these numerical formulas. So thank you for, thank you for this explanation, but you know, it's infuriating that they can't get it right and realize that there is difference in counties, and we have needs in Cuyahoga County that a lot of these other 88 counties, they're getting a windfall, and they're probably going to have a tough time figuring out how to spend it.
Yes, Mr. Rogers?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rubino, you mentioned that there will be a need for additional research in making a determination on whether it's feasible for the county to bond any of this money out. And I'm wondering how soon do you anticipate having that research done?
Mr. Chairman and the councilman, I didn't have a date in mind yet, but it's something we're going to be looking at for the next month or two.
Mr. Chair, I have a question on the same general topic on the bonding. Is this restriction, as far as the tax revenue bonding, I guess this is to the law director, only to the casino dollars, or is it in general?
This is the history of this is there used to be a prohibition on the Ohio Constitution. People use it generally. It's the lending credit to a private corporation, basically the state doing business with private corporations. And then they started putting limitations on that by having amendments to the Ohio Constitutions, and to give the state the ability basically to do private business by going out and doing business with the private sector to issue bonds. And so in removing that limitation on the ability to do bonds, for the state to borrow, to become indebted, they put the limitation that you cannot obligate monies raised by taxation for the bonds that you do. So it has nothing to do with the casinos. It's just a general prohibition anytime we go out to do bonding.
Does, Mr. Chair, the law director, then does this impede, or is this in any way related to a $100 million economic development fund and the ability to bond that out as well?
No, because we're not bonding it from tax revenue, and I'll let them address how they're bonding. But no, that's not effective.
Okay.
Councilman Greenspan, for the plan has been for the Economic Development Fund to utilize the county's non-tax revenue pledge. So we will be spending a certain amount of dollars per year, but we're obligating not tax dollars, but non-tax revenue dollars to the county. And going back to the economic development, in some sense, it is what we define it to be. There are purposes that would not be restricted or included in that part of the Ohio Constitution that we could term economic development, but if they are public infrastructure that allows other projects to take place or provides the underlying base, we can achieve that, and we could most likely, I'm not an attorney, but I could say most likely, utilize our general obligation pledge or tax revenue if it's not falling into one of those categories that the law director had mentioned. And I'll give you a quick example. The Medical Mart project falls into that category defined in the Constitution, but of that total $465 million project, we actually did identify over $20 million of that economic development project that was actually public infrastructure, and we were able to issue or consider those tax exempt, which allowed us to take advantage of some of the federal subsidies associated with the Build America Bond program. But it gives you an example. The creative uses that we apply in achieving economic development may or may not fall into that group of categories that we were discussing that are in the Constitution. It really depends on how we tailor the use. So we could still spur economic development and not be limited by that portion of the Constitution.
And if I can add, Mr. Chairman, back to the councilman's question about bonding, if we know that that's the intent of council and the executive, that's what we'll do. I want to be careful we're not viewed as what can we do, what can't we do. We have a very bright executive. I know the economic development staff are here, 11 council members. We would like to operate under the process of you decide what you want to do, and then allow us as the fiscal side and your law director to try to figure out how to achieve that. But it's going to take collaboration between the executive, economic development, and council. And if you have some distinct plans on how you want to go forward, I think we'll be able to figure out a way to make that work within the confines of the law. We're not talking about skirting the law. But we'd like to try to, if there is a challenge or a problem, find a solution for it once we know what you want to do. We're decision support in the decisions, the executive and the council, taking us forward in a certain direction.
I always like financial folks who say, we'll find the answer, you give me the problem. So, thank you. Ms. Convo?
Through the chair to Mr. Steen, the uses that are in the future decided for these tax revenue, will it have any impact on our AAA bond rating?
To the councilwoman through the chair, the question was about impact to the bond rating. It could. It could also, depending on bonding, it could have, we have debt limitations also. So all of those things would have to be factored in. If the directive is that you'd want to bond this out and the bond is of a certain amount, one, we'd want as high a rating as we could to lower interest, but also it would add to the county's overall debt. So we would have to factor all of that into the information we provide when you make a decision. But yes, the answer is it would impact that.
Mr. Jones?
Mr. Chairman, can you elaborate on what you see the distinction between the economic development and the $100 million fund and what we can do with these tax revenue dollars? And that might be better directed to the
If I can, I'm going to look the other way for another lifeline. I'm not sure if I would be the right person to distinguish the economic development, $100 million economic development fund, and funds that come from the casino that are economic development related. Would Larry or Nate want to describe how you might see those?
I'm trying to get Larry to go up for me. Councilman, if the question is with respect to the legislation that has been proposed by the county executive, we distinguish between funds that are allocated for between the $100 million fund and the proposed casino revenue legislation by saying that casino revenue would be dedicated to downtown projects. So it limits the geography. And it does not limit some of the uses the way that the Western Reserve Fund does, targeted to explicitly towards job creation. So some of the items that could be conceived would be some public infrastructure improvements, which would not be a Western Reserve Fund eligible expense. Housing conversion of property for housing purposes, which would not be an eligible expense. But there would be some overlap too in job creation uses.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I've got a few as long as we still have a few minutes.
I'm sorry, a budget question on non-tax revenues. How much do we receive in non-tax revenues? And what are some of the sources of that?
Give me 1 minute. I'll turn to, I may have a report. It's about $90 million a year, Councilman Rogers.
Mm-hmm.
I may have a summary in my binder. Let's talk about 2011 in terms of non-tax revenue. The main categories are charges for services, so courts, fees, and fines, charges for a portion of charges for real estate transactions, and some of the other fees we charge to counties and to other county funds. And in 2011, that was almost 37 million of that portion. Investment earnings last year, that was 12.5 million. And as you'll see, as I go through these categories, they're not considered tax revenue, but they have some linkage to tax dollars. When you think about it, investment earnings, a lot of that money was earned on tax revenue, but it's not considered legally to be tax revenue. Intergovernmental revenue, that's not part of the local government fund distribution, so we get some other reimbursements related to property tax and a few other federal or state reimbursements. Public defender reimbursement, that's in that category. That was $8.5 million last year. Permits and fines, which are separate from the court fees, those were $9.6 million last year. And then we have an other category, which was 10.6. These are one-time payments, reimbursements. There's some other categories, some other payment streams that we lump into that other category. And last year, we were just under 80 million. It's been higher in years past, but we average around the 80 to 90 million mark from year to year.
Other questions? In regards to Ms. Conwell's question about debt, if you were to allocate sources of funds for a debt, do you always have to allocate 100%, or could you have you allocated 30, 40, 50%, for example? If we had 8.8 million, could you go into a bonding formula that says we're only going to allocate 4.4 and have a more definitive stream well within your even ultra-conservative point of view?
Mr. Chairman, at the risk of putting everyone to sleep, I can speak a little bit to the pledge, how they normally work. You asked for it, so I will answer the question. Traditionally, what we've done when we issue bonds, whether it's for capital improvements or for economic development, we usually go with a single pledge, either non-tax revenue in the case of our development or revenue bonds. In the case of capital improvements, we've utilized our general obligation pledge, which is based on the ability to levy property taxes. There are some cases, we have not done this to my knowledge, you can do what's called a double barrel pledge, where you would identify two or more sources of obligation, so two types of revenue, but within the confines of legal restrictions. Source of repayment is separate. You designate an obligation or security for the debt, then you also designate the source of repayment. So in the case of capital improvement bonds, we use a GO pledge, and the source of repayment could be tax revenue, sales tax, anything. We don't specifically mention sales tax or charges for services, but we will designate either the ability to levy property taxes or other county revenue to make the payments. With the economic development bonds we've done in the past few years, we've had a singular pledge, non-tax revenue, and then a singular source of repayment, non-tax revenue. We generally stick with very strong, straightforward pledges, and we designate very specific sources of repayment. It looks clean on paper. It's received well by both rating agencies and investors, so we've done that in the past. I think what happens when you start dicing up the pledge, going beyond two or more, it may be viewed as less secure. Even if it's not, it may be viewed as less secure. So that's something we're mindful of. And anytime we're doing these structuring of bonds and working on the legal requirements, we're working with bond counsel, with county law staff, with underwriters and financial advisors. It's a complicated process, but in the past we've gone with a more simplistic approach.
I think you indicated you had not done any modeling of other national programs yet. It seems to me it would be beneficial for this committee for you to go out and seek. There's got to be other national business models that are ahead of us in this game, and we ought to be able to learn something by best practices out there. And is there an ongoing dialogue between the other three host counties as far as on this very subject, as far as how they intend to use their funds?
Mr. Chairman, there hasn't been a very strong dialogue with the other counties. There's four different situations. Cuyahoga's situation is markedly different than Hamilton's. Hamilton County is under a good bit of duress right now related to stadium bonds they issued and a sales tax pledge. I don't know what they're doing. I would guess they're probably going to need that revenue to bolster their bottom line, their operating line, because of some of the difficulty they're having with their stadium bonds. Franklin is more stable. They're similar to Cuyahoga. I believe there was a portion, and Wade can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the amendment had a provision about how Columbus would use some of their tax revenue. I believe they're going to use it for Nationwide Arena. So they've already designated a portion, I think in the actual amendment. Lucas is probably similar to us, maybe a little bit in the middle between us and Hamilton. I do not know if they've identified other uses other than operating. That's part of the research I think we'll be doing on top of actually looking outside of the state of Ohio and seeing if anyone is utilizing some sort of casino tax pledge for bonds. But not just that, but separate from actually supporting the infrastructure or an actual gaming facility. I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere out there someone utilized a pledge of casino tax revenue to help fund the construction of a casino for a developer. We're doing something different here. We actually want to take that tax revenue and use it for county priorities, not a development project from the outside.
Well, if you could do that research, I'm sure it would be beneficial to find out what other areas are doing and what their ideas and thoughts have been in the past. And then just more for curiosity, what's the percentage that the racinos share back to the state as opposed to our 33% that comes out of the casino side. Do you know what they share of
Mr.
their
Chairman,
gross
I
revenue?
think the Racino rate is 33.5%.
Same rate.
Similar rate, 33.5, so very similar. But remember, the distribution is straight path to the Ohio schools. There may be some administrative dollars going back to the state, but it's all flowing to benefit the school districts.
Any other questions based on mine? Thank you. We appreciate the update, and it's about what I figured it would take us about an hour to get to that.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Mr. Warren, if you would be so kind, and first I want to thank Mayor Jackson for allowing you to come here today. We greatly appreciate that, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did not prepare remarks. I came prepared to answer questions based on our conversation. So wherever you want to start.
Well, just from, as you can tell, we have pretty well a blank sheet of paper right now in the county, and I guess it's my understanding that that's pretty close to where the city of Cleveland is at this moment in time without any preconceived notion. So I guess for benefit of the rest of the council members, they were kind of more curious with the chief executive's proposal to be asking where is the city of Cleveland in regards to definitively saying, other than the 15% that the public, I think, is aware of through the media, has there been any other identification of how you're going to allocate those funds? And if the answer is you're still in your process, that's fine too.
We are in the midst of our process. First, I think the presentation you just heard was one of the best I've heard on kind of explaining the particulars of the various formulas. The projections that Matt Rubino put forward, we share, and we also share the need to be circumspect and cautious as we go forward. As he described, the share of casino revenues of the state fund that will come from to Cleveland will be the half of Cuyahoga County amount plus the 5%. And I do believe that is of gross revenues out of the Cleveland casino. And so our projections track with the projections you just heard and with the caveats. I think the 5% would be if you kind of reach a point of leveling off at 9.7 million to the county in 2014. We would expect to be that 9.7, and probably if you add our 5%, we'd be up to about 13.5 to 15, depending on how this plays out on the 2014. And as was drawn out by Councilman Greenspan, the possibility of a second phase casino would dramatically increase those numbers to both Cleveland and the counties throughout Ohio. With respect to our process, you referred to the 15%. What that is tied to is an ordinance passed by our city council. I believe it was last November, late October, just before Thanksgiving, where that ordinance prescribed that 15% of the casino revenues that come to Cleveland, whatever that might be, at least 15% be reserved for neighborhood improvement and development projects. That leaves the 85%, which the city, through our administration, through Mayor Jackson's administration, is in the process of developing our approaches. Any approach that we end up determining will have to go through our political process, decision-making process, involving legislation authorizing expenditures. So we are in that process, just as you are. We're looking at options. As I said, we are very much aware that the projections are just that, they're projections. You know, we've already seen a 50% drop on projections. We're trying to, I won't repeat all the points that were made earlier, but there are a lot of uncertainties out there, and the mayor is hesitant to begin pledging dollars prior to knowing how this is going to play out, how the casinos perform not only in Cleveland but across the state, whether the second phase comes in or not, and that is a development that is proceeding in the due diligence phases, as it was you suggested, they own the land, but it's land. But we do know the sponsors are moving forward on their design. They're talking to us about that. They're hopeful, but they're not at a point where it's an ironclad certainty. We have other considerations as the host city as well, and this is partly offset by the generation of new taxes, not the casino taxes, but income taxes, parking taxes, real estate taxes that will flow to us. But that is, we have service costs. We have new expenses as well that have to do with the location of the casino in our city, particularly public safety expenses, public service expenses. And we are devoting a good deal of the new local taxes that come to us to offset those expenses, so we're not draining services from other parts of our city so as to support a safe, secure, well-served casino. The priorities we have, and the mayor has mentioned this publicly, is in fact aligned with the economic development priority. We also have to look at how we're affected, and the point made about local government taxes from or the distribution from the state is an important one as we look to balance our budgets and address in particular deferred capital investments that have been deferred in past years on key city facilities. So that's a factor. That is all going into a review by the administration and will play out over the course of the months to come by way of expenditure recommendations by the mayor to our city council.
Thank you, Mr. Warren. Prior to opening it up for questions, if there would be any, I would just ask that, recognizing that we have a member of another governmental body here, and he is obligated, obviously, back to his other governmental body, so we'll try and be as gentle as possible.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'd ask my colleagues to recognize that it's a real thank you for you coming before us, because it would have been easy for you to say no. We will choose not to participate, and so thank you very much for coming forward and being part of where we are trying to get our dialogue in place and figure out where we're going to be. Are there any questions for Mr. Warren? Yes, Ms. Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for being here.
Yeah,
I'm sure you like being here to allow us to know what's happening in Cleveland, so we could get this conversation going, so thank you. The bed tax is anticipated to go up as well for the city of Cleveland, correct? With the occupation of the hotels, I think, have been at maximum amounts. Do you envision seeing additional revenue from that as well?
I would expect there would be an increase.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, we won't, we really need to see how the expected kind of stimulation of the local economy plays out in taxes. The next 6 months, as was said, will give us a better idea. But we'll have hotels will be doing better business, not just because of the casino, but because of the medical mart when that opens next year. So we would expect some increase in the bed tax.
One more question.
We don't have a good figure on that, though.
The only other, thank you. The only other question I have is the 15%, did I hear you say, of the receipts to the city of Cleveland would be allocated for neighborhood revitalization? Is that the percentage that will go into the neighborhoods for infrastructure and those purposes?
Mr. Chairman, to the councilwoman, that's correct.
And would that be allocated by each ward? Each council person would get a percentage of that 15%?
Mr. Chairman, to the councilwoman, no, it's not divided by ward. It is an amount based on projects throughout the city and neighborhoods. Certainly, there will be input from each and every member of council.
I see. So the city of Cleveland thinks that it's important to at least put some of the dollars toward those purposes.
That was Mr. Chairman, to the councilwoman, that's the ordinance that was passed.
Greenspan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm curious, what discussions have taken place between the county and the city as it relates to any fiscal impact that the county may be able to provide to the city? As it relates to our portion, the county's portion of the casino revenue.
Mr. Chairman, to the councilman, we work with the county, have and will continue to work with the county on particularly economic development matters, and not just downtown, but throughout the city, and that so that we learned of the county executive's proposal just in the with the state of the county address. We have had some discussions, but we recognize that the executive is going through the process here, and we have. But while we continue to work cooperatively on particular development opportunities, and always has, this predates the discussion of casino money, on opportunities in downtown Cleveland, we have not had any particular discussions with the county about particular projects or investments out of this fund, other than being aware through the public knowledge of the proposal.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Warren. We very, very much appreciate you coming forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Tim,
Appreciate it.
yes, I thought, didn't see anybody else give me your hand. I said, all right.
Thank you, Mr. Warren. Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
I represent Parma Heights, Seven Hills, Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And, you know, in general, people want to support the executive and what he's doing. As recently as last night, I was addressing Parma City Council, and this very subject came up. We also had one of the biggest events, the community events in the city at the Ribbon Rock, at which I was at. And believe it or not, people that know me came up and expressed their opinion about how this casino money can be spent. And in our initial briefing on this, I mean, the emphasis was, you know, this downtown vibrancy. You know, we have the casino, the medical mart, and all these conventions, and so much happening. People are now coming back downtown for restaurants. So, you know, it's obvious we're something that, you know, suburbanites are proud of, but of course everybody is hurting. In particular, and I haven't been bashful about it, I've said that, you know, I want to be supportive of the executive and his vision and the possibility that, you know, we want to use these funds to prime the pump so that this can be vibrant and things could go on. But in general, the feedback is, well, if we're going to do that, you know, these funds should prime the pump and stimulate, but we can't constantly and forever take these county funds and do it for the downtown. So that's one thing I've heard reoccurring. And the second thing is, when I talk about the vibrancy and having the territory, and they ask the question, you know, what's the territory? I say the lake, the inner belt, the east side of Cleveland State and West 25th. The very next question, almost universally, is, well, what is Cleveland doing? So I can tell you, at least from this council person, we need to have Cleveland collaborate with the county, because we don't want just county funds going into downtown and Cleveland not being part of that. And so I'm just saying this is what I'm hearing, and you know, there's other people that are saying just divide it, and I use the expression of spreading the peanut butter too thin, and sometimes I'm not too popular when I say that we want to use the funds for impact. And I think that's what the executive, every time I've heard him talk about this, it's, you know, let's do something that is going to help revitalize and keep the city vibrant, or make the city more vibrant. So I just want you to know that That's what I'm hearing in my section of town.
I don't know if there was a question there, but I just,
No, it wasn't.
okay.
I thought
Okay.
he ought
Yeah.
to hear it.
Thank you.
I appreciate the comment. I will say that that we agree that impact is going to take a cooperative approach with resources. I think our record is strong in that respect by way of the city's investments in the area you talked about, as well as other areas of Cleveland, but particularly in the downtown, done often in collaboration with the county. That would be the approach we would want to continue. I wish I could stand here and tell you, well, here's the dollars and cents, so much over here, but we're going through our process as well. And it would be, we have to let that process play out. But I respect your point of view and really like the comment about people seeing more activity downtown, the residents of Parma. I think that's a plus. And they want to see that momentum continue, and we would agree.
Mr. Chairman, can I just
Sure.
follow up on that? You know, what I'm proud about most, because everybody's saying, hey, how's this going, this county council? I'm proud of my council members because we have not been territorial. And there's always this temptation. I know I come from the city of Parma where there was wards. Council people naturally, this is for my ward. If they're going to get so much paving, I want this much paving in my road. We haven't done that, and that is a credit to the thinking of all this council. We have not become territorial. We're trying to do what's best. We're trying to have vision and have impact. So I just wanted to say that to my
Thank you,
fellow
Mr.
members
Warren.
of council.
Thank you.
Appreciate you
Thank
coming.
to the
Thank
council.
you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. And it does seem like all the roads are going to Parma, doesn't it?
I know you're going to bring that up.
With that, at the next meeting of Committee of the Whole is on the 26th, so if council members have ideas and thoughts and comments, please be prepared to bring them at the next meeting, and we'll have them ready to go. I know that as we sit here time-wise, it is 1 o'clock. It's 1 o'clock, not 3 o'clock.
Yes, the meeting on the 26th is at 1 o'clock, so I think we need to bring food because we'll be going through to a 5 o'clock meeting, so.
That can't all be just this portion of the committee. Okay. Oh, sure, okay, all right.
Yeah, we have this, and then we have the medical mart update, and then we have a regular meeting, so, bring stamina, maybe we'll order some pizza or something, at our own expense.
What's that? Yeah, yes, Mr. Miller?
At the meeting on the 26th, is it your intention that that your colleagues would simply present and put forward ideas, or are you hoping to actually vote on some things at that time?
It's my intention that they would be bringing forth ideas. I don't know that anybody was going to be bringing forth specific pieces of legislation, but if they do, either to amend or substitute, I think that there might be some conversations. I've heard rumors to that effect, that there might be, and so it would be my thought that if there are going to be presentations, that they would be either bringing forth them in conversational mode, or there will be, I think, some discussions about people wanted to have a specific piece of legislation. Yes.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, they will be submitting them as, my understanding is either amendments or substitutions, which would already be covered by the current piece of the ordinance that's on the table.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, in fact, I do have a proposed substitute that I at least want our clerk to hand out before we depart, to have in hand a proposal that I have, so we can be ready to talk about it next time.
I think, Mr. Greenspan, did you have one that you would like to at least hand out the same way?
You have my copies, it's up to the chair.
Okay, I'll go ahead and submit them so they can be, if anybody else has any ones that they would like to introduce as substitutes, they can be marked at least for the record purposes. Here, I'll let. Here, what's that?
Exhibit A or what? Plaintiff's Exhibit A?
Exhibit A, right? Sorry about that. Got the other brain on. Yeah, legal talk. So with that, is there any other miscellaneous business to come before? Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to clarify, this was a question when the fiscal officer and Mr. Rubino were speaking was asked, which was, what is the gross casino revenue, and it's defined in the Constitution. It is the gambling revenue minus the winnings to the wagers. It does not include the food. And
I didn't think it could. There's not a restaurant out there that can make it on 33%.
I just wanted
I
to
don't
make
think.
sure.
That when somebody said they're going to take 33% of your restaurant revenue, that doesn't leave much on the table. No pun intended. Are there any public comments that anyone signed in for?
Mr. Chair, no one has signed in.
Hearing none. Is there any other discussion? Adjourn the meeting.